They had taken almost everything. The estate of Caldemir's former top-ranked combat sovereign, its east wing sealed, its trophy cases emptied, its hunting contracts voided, sat under creditor notice on a gray Tuesday morning. Lord Fenrith's appointed auditors were due at the 9th bell. They would take the deed, the last hunting's licenses, and whatever personal effects hadn't already been auctioned, to cover the debts the noble faction manufactured in the 14 months since the obsidian shaft collapse. Railsohn sat by the window in the wheelchair he had not left since that collapse, watching the courtyard gate, his silver-white hair, bleached out by the mana severance the physicians said, though none of them could explain exactly what the severance had done, fell past his jaw. Dark coat, hands still in his lap. He had not moved in 3 hours. This was not unusual. Since the collapse had inverted his mana channels, closing them off from any detectable flow, stillness had become his default state. The Hunter Registry Board had come to the estate personally to inform him that a mana null rating disqualified him from active licensing. They'd had the courtesy to look uncomfortable while they said it. His name had been struck from the registry the following morning. The kingdom's finest combat sovereign, the man who had solo cleared the Crimson Labyrinth at 32, who had held the 1 rank for 6 unbroken years, was now a line item in a creditor's ledger. Mira set a cup of tea on the side table without comment. She was the court-appointed caretaker, assigned by the same noble faction that held the debt, technically there to manage the estate's final accounting. She had a brother with a failing manicure and medical bills that eclipsed her savings. Job paid. She had planned to stay 3 weeks. She had stayed 14 months. Rail had never asked her to. She had never explained why she did. In 14 months, she had not once looked at him with pity. This was, he had decided, the rarest thing left in Caldemir. "They're early," she said, watching the gate. He had already seen the carriages, 4 of them. Lord Fenrath's personal seal on the limit door, which meant Fenrath himself had come to watch. That was new. The nobleman had sent agents for every prior proceeding. The fact that he'd come in person meant he wanted to see Rael's face when the deed changed. Hands. Rael picked up the tea. He drank it slowly. He had noticed the pressure 7 months ago, a deep, oppressive weight that had no location. Not in his chest, not in his spine. More like the air around him had acquired a slow, patient density. To Mira, he hadn't mentioned it to anyone. The physicians he'd dismissed 8 months prior had already written their conclusions. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like a man inventing reasons to hope, and Railsohn had not been in the business of hope for a long time. But the pressure had kept building. 14 months of stillness. 14 months of a paralyzed body and inverted channels with nowhere to send whatever was accumulating. Feel it now the way you feel a held breath at its absolute limit. Not painful, not urgent, just full. Completely, utterly full. The 9th bell rang. The courtyard gates opened. Lord Fenrath descended from his carriage in ceremonial hunting whites, the rank insignia of an S-tier licensed noble hunter gleaming at his collar. He was followed by 6 auditors, 2 registry witnesses, and 4 armed escorts. He crossed the courtyard without looking up at the window. He already knew exactly where Rael was. Mira moved toward the door. "I'll go down." "Stay," Rael said. She turned. It wasn't a request she was accustomed to hearing from him. He rarely asked for anything. She stayed. The auditors' voices carried up from the foyer. Deed transfer, asset inventory, registry witness signatures. Standard language for the end of a life's work. Fenrath said something that made the auditors laugh. Rael didn't hear the words. He was watching the sky above the eastern garden, where a thin seam of light had appeared that had no business being there. The seam widened. System notification, rift classification, rank. Estimated emergence radius, 400 meters. Time to first wave emergence, 90 seconds. The auditors heard it too. The laughter stopped. One of the escorts shouted something. Dungeon rifts above residential districts were not unheard of. The Caldemir grid had 3 registered fault lines. But an S-rank above a noble estate, mid-morning, with no warning from the city's detection array, was a different order of problem. An S-rank emergence without a ranked combat sovereign on site would level the block. Fenrath's escorts drew weapons that would do precisely nothing against what was about to come through. The seam split open. First spawn came through the rift like a cracked fault line given mass. A gravity-class dungeon predator, plated 60 meters at the shoulder, the kind of creature that bent light around its own density. Then a second. The ground cracked under the first footfall. Mira grabbed the window frame. Rael set down his tea, system channel analysis, standard mana flow, null, inverted accumulation, critical, pressure storage. 14 months 412 days of motile suppression. Accumulated force, unclassified. Release threshold, exceeded. He had wondered, sometimes, in the long still nights, what the inversion actually was. The physicians had called it damage. The registry had called it disqualification. He had called it nothing, because he had no name for it and no one to ask. The system, apparently, had been keeping count. Skill unlocked void pressure, release, warning, no upper boundary on calculated yield. Rael exhaled. It wasn't dramatic, not from the outside. His hands still in his lap, open slightly. The coat didn't move. His expression didn't change. What happened to the courtyard was dramatic. The pressure that had been building in his inverted channels for 412 days left his body in a single radial pulse, not an explosion but a compression, a wall of gravity-type force expanding outward at floor level, then reversing, then slamming upward toward the rift mouth. The first spawn was hit mid-stride. It didn't fall so much as stop existing as a moving object. It folded, compacted, pinned against the rift wall by a force the dungeon's own classification system apparently had no metric for. The second spawn cleared the rift edge and met the same result before its feet touched stone. The auditors were on the ground. Fenrath's escorts had lost their footing. Fenrath himself was against the courtyard wall, one hand braced. The ceremonial whites now streaked with gravel dust. Staring up at a window, Rael stood up. It was the first time in 14 months. His legs, which the physicians had called permanently compromised, the nerve damage irreversible, the motor function gone, held his weight without complaint. The secondary effect, he understood now, had been happening the whole time. The void pressure building in his inverted channels had been rerouting, slowly, through every damaged pathway, clearing the blockages the collapse had left behind. Every day of stillness had been, simultaneously, a day of repair. He hadn't known. He also, looking back, was not entirely surprised. He walked to the window. He looked down at Fenrath. The rift was still open. S-rank rifts didn't close on their own, and the two spawn were compressed debris, not closed exits. Earl released a second pulse, smaller, precise, surgical, the kind of controlled void pressure that required no dramatic gesture, no stance, no shout. The rift sealed with a sound like a pressure valve releasing. The city's dungeon detection array, now catching up to what had already happened, lit up across the district. Hunter response units would arrive within minutes. They would find a sealed S-rank rift, 2 neutralized spawns, and a man standing at a second-floor window who was not supposed to be standing anywhere. System classification update, Rael Sohn, former designation, inactive mana null, revised designation, gravity sovereign, classification, unranked, above current system parameters, registry status, mandatory reinstatement pending board review. Lord Fenrath was still against the wall. The ceremonial whites were ruined. His 6 auditors, his 2 registry witnesses, and his 4 escort were picking themselves up from the courtyard stone, and every single one of them was looking at the window. Fenrath's mouth moved. It took a moment before the words carried up. Son I, this was a we can renegotiate thee. Rael looked at him the way you look at a problem that has already been solved. The deed, Rael said, stays. Fenrath nodded. He kept nodding. The man who had engineered the obsidian shaft collapse, who had spent 14 months dismantling the life of the kingdom's finest combat sovereign, piece by piece, who had come in person this morning to watch the rest of it disappear, was nodding in a courtyard full of rubble he had caused, because the alternative was worse, and he knew it. The Hunter response units arrived 11 minutes later. The registry board's emergency liaison arrived 20 minutes after that, bearing a provisional reinstatement document that 3 board members had already signed. They had seen the rift seal on the city's detection array. They knew what void pressure of that yield meant, even if the classification system didn't have a box for it yet. Mira was still at the window when Rael turned away from it. She hadn't said anything since the first spawn came through. She said nothing now. She looked at him, standing, steady, the coat still settled across his shoulders, with an expression that wasn't surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something she had suspected for a long time, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to. He picked up the tea. It had gone cold. Below them, in the rubble of his own making, Lord Fenrith of Caldonmere was still looking up at the window. The deed to the estate was still on the auditor's table, unsigned. The registry liaison was asking someone to verify the spelling of a rank, designation that had never been entered into the system before. Gravity Sovereign, unranked, above current system parameters. The kingdom's finest combat sovereign had been sitting in a wheelchair for 14 months, loading. They should have left him alone.